Importing data into a workbook from an external file is one of the most common questions I get from students because it's really the first step in building your macro is that you need to get the data where it needs to be before you can work on it or make any kind of decisions, generate reports, or anything. So let's start with how to do that.
All right, you're welcome to go out to that'ssobasic.com on the Intro to VBA tab and download the companion file that goes with this video, or you're welcome to just follow along. What you have here is sort of an input tab. If you were to start from a point of saying what files do I want to pull in and where are they located, I've given you a really basic setup here where you're giving the full file path of the file as well as the individual file name of the raw data that you're trying to pull into your macro. And then the idea is we're going to write a procedure that's going to go out to this file path, interact with this file, grab the data, and dump it into this output tab here. And then we're going to assign that macro to this button that's called pull data. And of course, if we were to run it subsequently, we would want to clear any remaining data from the last time that we pulled. So we'll start out with clearing this tab first. All right, so if you go to Alt F11 and then go into your project, right click and insert a module. We'll go ahead and call this sub pull data. Now, the syntax that I'm going to be using here is not by any means perfect. If I was to consider every possible scenario that could occur and write the perfect code, this video would go on forever and ever. And so I'm giving you a specific use case that can be applied to many scenarios, but it's not meant to go to every scenario. It's just a great place to start. So start out with the output tab, and we're going to clear the cells. So we'll say with sheets output, and then we'll say dot cells dot clear contents. I love this syntax because it applies to every cell within that worksheet, and it clears the values within those cells, but it doesn't clear the formatting. It doesn't clear any specific, if you wanted to have commas in a certain column, but you wanted to have text in a different column, you could leave those settings to be carried over to the future without retaining the values that were in each individual cell. Of course, if you do want to clear everything out and just start fresh, then you could have just typed .clear instead of .clear contents. It's really up to you. .clear would get rid of everything, including formats, while contents is going to be just the values. And then we'll just type end with. We can come back here and type more in here later. I'm just going to close it off for now. And then go back to your input tab. And we're going to define these two variables as being B4 is your file path and C4 is going to be your file name. Let's go ahead and put option explicit at the top. And then that means that we're going to have to define variables as we go along. So we'll say dim fpath, that's going to be my full file path, as string, and fname as string. And I like to use fpath as file path and fname as string. So now we'll type another with statement, and instead we're going to do with sheets input. And just as a friendly reminder, if I don't include the dot, the line of code that's in between the with statements won't know what to associate with. So by putting a dot here, it knows that these cells exist on sheets output, and it's connecting these two. If I leave the dot out, then it's just going to clear the cells on whichever sheet I happen to have active. And of course, that would be awful, because if I was to clear the contents on this sheet, then I would lose all my file paths. So please be careful. Remember that when you're in a with statement to put the dot before the lines of code that end up in between. So we'll type dot, and then we'll refer to the range B3. So that's my file path. And then we're going to assign that to the variable fpath. And remember, whatever we put on the left is going to assume the value of the item on the right of the equality sign. And now we'll type fname equals dot range. I just realized that we're actually in B4 and C4, so I need to type C4 here, and I need to fix this to say B4. And then we'll type end with. Okay, now we're going to use the workbooks.open method, which is integral to being able to pull data from an external source. There's also the open text method, which is a different topic all on its own. If you're working primarily with text files, you can reference that as well. If you're working with a .csv file, then the workbooks.open method will work, and the workbooks.openText method will also work. .csv is kind of a cool file because it can be opened in multiple ways and will work this way as well. So we'll say workbooks.open, and then we'll type file name :equals. And so this is how we're setting what are the arguments that is associated with the .open method. So workbooks is the collection, the object collection. .open is kind of like the verb or the method that's being executed. And then file name is a parameter that is requesting not the specific name of the file, but the entire file path. So we're going to reference fpath, which was in range before, as the exact location of the file that we want to open. And then this is kind of a little bonus, is that I like to type read only : equals true, because in the case where I'm going to be pulling data from an external source, by opening it read only, there's two benefits. One is I can't accidentally change the external data. And two, I am not going to be blocking anybody else from opening it in a non-read-only state. So if I was to do read only equals false, which false is the default, then I'm going to be in that external file and other people will see me as in that file and be waiting for me to get out potentially. So I really like read only equals true, especially in team environments. So once that workbook opens, if it's found, you're going to want to assign it to a variable. If it's not found, then you're going to get some kind of error code, and please see my error handling video to kind of think about ideas of how you might want to deal with that. And so here we'll do a comma. I like to use the word away as workbook. And I think of away as the workbook that I opened. And I think of home, or this workbook, as my starting point. And so if you want to think of it in like a sports analogy, you have your home team and your away team. Your external data is the away team. And so we'll type set away equals workbooks. And then now we're going to type fname because that's the file name that's associated with the file path that we opened. Now in reality, I pull the file name out of the file path itself. I never actually enter both, but you would need to watch my string manipulation video in order to understand how to do that. We're going to kind of skip over that by having them entered separately, but that's not necessary in a real world scenario. So now that I've identified the away workbook, I'm going to figure out the size and shape of my data. And so try to figure out if I actually have it open. I do have it open. It's right here. So if you go to look at my data here, I've given you kind of an irregular shape. Now, column B is where the data starts. And the method I'm going to teach you here is as if you looked at the data and you said, all right, so I kind of see that it starts here in B5 and that it goes to F, and I specifically want to grab this section and down. And I'm going to maybe ignore this part, and I'm going to go all the way down to this last row right here in row 74. So again, it's a specific example where I'm trying to get like a specific section of the data. And what I want to tell you not to do is just automatically count things from A1. Because if I was to say, all right, how many rows of data exist in A1, or sorry, in column A, then I'm going to get 2. And then I would only pull this information from my data set if I was to use a row counter to say, you know, how big is my data set in column A. And so I want you to get in the habit of thinking, if I'm trying to count how many rows exist, what's the best and most accurate column from which to do the counting sort of method, right? I want to count column B because that's a good indicator of how big my data is. Column A is not a good indicator here. So what we're going to do is type lrow. Well, actually, let's do with active sheet. And that means that within this workbook that we've just opened, I'm going to be interacting with the sheet that happens to be active instead of selecting a specific sheet. You could still select a specific sheet. Say, for example, if there was 5 sheets here and you know that you wanted to select the sheet called My Data, then you could make that specification. I only have one sheet here, so it really wouldn't matter whether I refer to it as my data or if I refer to it as active sheet. To be a little bit more specific, why don't we go ahead and refer to it as my data? That might be better. So we could say sheets my data. Am I spelling that right? Yes, I am. And then we're going to go ahead and type the end with immediately because it's really easy to forget to type those. And then this is kind of like a little safety catch right there, right? And then we're going to count the number of rows in column B. So we'll type lrow equals, and then remember the dot, and then cells rows dot count, and we'll type the letter B to represent which column we want to count. And then we'll type dot end, XL up, dot row. And so if you'll recall, this is a specific cell that we're locating in that table or that column. And then we're extracting the row property from that cell that was found. And so what it's doing is it's going to the very bottom and then doing dot end brings you down to this row a little bit past 1 million. And then XL up brings you to the first non-blank cell in column B. And now you're finding row 74 by returning the dot row property of this particular cell. Now, what you want to be very careful of in some cases is not to simply interact with this header row, because if I was to go all the way up here and I wanted to make sure I never cleared this row, I could set a minimum and say never let last row be above 6, because 6 is really where the data starts. In our case, it doesn't matter because I'm totally happy if I just end up copying the header, but it's something for you to consider is that your header could become selected and active on a blank data set. All right, so I know this is going to return row 74. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to type dot range, and then we're going to use concatenate to combine this last row, L row is 74, with the range. We know it starts in B5, and we know it goes until F, and we're going to say F and L row. So we'll type quote B5, F quote, then type the ampersand, and L row. Then you're going to type that copy. And what that's going to do is it's going to take B5 to F74. So this concatenate just takes two strings and it combines them together. And it creates that range that we're going to copy to our clipboard. Now we need to define this variable long as, and you could use a string technically because, I mean, it's really up to you. You could assign a number to a string or an integer or a double. It really doesn't matter in this case. I like to use lrow as long, and that means it's a whole positive or negative number. Those are great for any kind of row counting. And then it doesn't matter that we're actually taking a long and combining it with a string, because Excel gives us a little bit of flexibility when combining these two together. And so we're going to execute the dot copy method, and now we want to specifically paste this to the range in the pull data workbook on the output tab in range A1. So we will type, next we're going to activate our original workbook by typing this workbook.activate. And this brings us back to the location of where we're going to actually paste our data. And then you're going to type sheets output dot range A1 dot paste special. And paste special is just going to take what's on your clipboard and paste it over, including the formats, but not necessarily the column widths. And in order to make it look a little bit better, we can auto fit those column widths. So we could say sheets output dot columns dot auto fit. And that's just kind of a little bonus for you right there. You don't have to do that because it'll look fine without it. But let's go ahead and run through this code and see what it looks like. I'm going to resize this. I went ahead and put some sample data here because I wanted to give you guys something that clear. It's just some fancy editing. I slipped that in there. And if we go back up to the top, let's type F8. We're going to run it one line of code at a time. I'm going to go ahead and go to the tab so you can actually see what it looks like. So we'll select output. And remember, I don't have to be on the tab for this to be happening because I've indicated with which sheet to perform each action. So we'll do .cells.clear contents. Again, that's just getting rid of the values. As you can see, all of my formatting has been retained from the previous pull. And so now on the sheet's input, we're pulling the file path and the file name. So if you hit F8, you can hover over these variables with your mouse and see what's stored to them. This one's a string. This one's also a string, so we've got our file path and our file name. So now we go down to the workbooks.open method. Since I already have it open, it's not going to give me an error. It's just going to open it and show it as active. If you have a previous version of Excel, you may need to do a function to test if the workbook is already open, because you could get an error that says, this workbook's already open. Are you sure you want to reopen it? Because in older versions of Excel, there was a conflict where you could actually try to open something that was already open, which was sort of silly, and luckily they have fixed that in the current version of Excel. So then we're going to assign this variable, which we are taking mydata.xlsx, which we know is the file name from being input on our original workbook, and we're assigning that to the variable away. So this is a workbook object, hence why you can't hover over it and see the variable. It's also assigned with set, which means it's a little bit more complex. It's an object assignment. And now with sheets my data, which is specifically the sheet containing my data, we're going to copy from the corner in B5 all the way down to FN last row. So let's type F8. We get our last row, which is 74. We get our range. We're copying it, so you can see the marching ants are circling around the range that I've copied, which is a great visual for you to see that you actually got the range that you intended. So if I wanted, I could scroll down with my mouse here, and I can see that the marching ants go all the way down to row 74 in my last row of data. And then for this particular type of copy paste to work, you have to reactivate the original tab that you're trying to get to. So I do this workbook.activate. Just out of curiosity, I'm going to select the input tab and see if I can be on a different tab. And that's fine as long as you have the workbook, the destination workbook up. You can select any of those tabs, but it will still successfully paste in. If I had the other workbook up, which was my original raw data, right? If I was just to keep this up, and then let's go back and rerun this line of code that brings up the copy. So we got our marching ants, our range has been copied to the clipboard. I'm going to skip this line that says this workbook.activate, and I'm going to try to paste this. I get a subscript out of range runtime error 9. And the reason is that this particular type of copy paste doesn't work if the destination range that's being pasted into isn't in the active workbook. So that's why we have this line that says this workbook.activate. So I'm just going to pull that up, run through it really quick. And then that brings us to our next line of code that says sheets output.columns.autofit. It's pretty self-explanatory in that it's going to fit the data to the contents by expanding the column sizes to show all the information. So now it looks a lot better, and we've got all of our data copied in. I'm going to execute the end with, and before we finish, I'm going to write a couple lines of code because you don't really want to leave the external workbook that had our raw data open. You want to close it. And you also want to close it without prompting the user to ask them if that's okay, right? Because the macro is going to do it. So first we're going to turn off a setting called display alerts. We'll type application.displayalerts equals false. And then next we're going to say workbooks, or actually we can just type away because we created that object assignment. We assigned our external raw data to the variable away. So we'll say away.close. And then we're just going to copy this line here, and we're going to turn display alerts back on. Anytime you turn off an application level setting, you always want to turn it back on. And then lastly, since we did make an object assignment when we use the word set to assign a variable, that means that we always have to be sure to unassign it because it doesn't always drop out of memory perfectly. We're going to type set away equals nothing. And then lastly, let's make a message box that says that we're done and that your data imported successfully. All right, so we'll just drag our cursor up here. And remember, you can always right click in the margin and then select right here where it says set next statement. And the code will run from that point wherever your cursor was. So we'll type F8. Our external workbook just closed without prompting the user to save. We'll turn the display alerts back on, erase our variable, we get our message box, and everything is good to go. So in a nutshell, that was a very simple approach at copying external data. In reality, you will probably want to embed this code inside of a loop to where it opens this file and imports it to a specific tab. And perhaps you have many, many different imports. Or you could write all the code multiple times, try to make your code shorter by incorporating loops as much as you can. And of course, assign your data to a button and make it as user-friendly as possible. The last thing that I'll mention is that it does happen pretty often where your data is of irregular shapes and sizes, that it doesn't look the same day to day. So like, let's say, for example, that our external data did start in B5 and it went to column F. But what would we do if our data didn't go to column F, but instead it went to, I don't know, let's say column G? We're not going to capture that data automatically. So that's going to be a bit more of an advanced concept. I'll post a video about that at some point. But for the moment, I don't recommend that you just randomly grab a bunch of extra data to the right. I recommend that you actually count the number of columns that exist within the workbook and make a dynamic range. So again, that's a more advanced concept, but something for you to think about.